Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, the issue of my presentation is the theology of economic exclusion. I am waiting for a PowerPoint. It's global distribution and differences. As we can perfectly see, this is a very ambitious title, so I will present just hard data first, and then some hypotheses about what could be the causes of the economic exclusion and also inclusion nowadays. This is not working now. We have a problem. Hmm? No. No. Okay. Well, globalization is on the dock once again, and perhaps is right that he or she is in the dock. The problem, from my point of view, is that the debate frequently assumes three characteristics of the risky world of post-truth in which we live. Passions and emotions predominate over reasons, that data and information are left aside or directly invented, and finally, the public and the media prefer to see the snapshots of the moment and not the processes that unite them. I will very briefly present some snapshot of the recent globalization, that is to say the basic data on the static view, and then also very briefly the process involved, but I will try to concentrate in the third part, that is the hypothesis. The standard of living of developed countries measured by per capita GDP is more than 4 times that of developing countries nowadays. This is a lot. The emerging countries has the bulk of precarious jobs that amount 1.4 billion people, 42% of global employment, so precarious jobs. A real shame for humanity, according to the International Labour Office. There are 21 million people trafficked or in forced labor in the world, an issue that was dealt in several meetings by this academy, of which 19.5 are in the emerging countries and 60% of them in Asia Pacific. Near 700 million people, around 10% of the world population, lives yet in extreme poverty, which live less than $190 per day. And the poverty headcount ratio at $3.10 was nowadays in Nigeria 76.5%, less in other countries. Regarding hunger, mainly because of wars, there are now 20 million people at serious risk of starvation in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen, the highest figure since the Second World War. Regarding housing, in the poorest countries, 2/3 of the population live in precarious housing in slums. In Latin America is yet 1/5, and in some African countries reaches up to 75% nowadays. Regarding income and wealth distribution, well, we have had the exposition of Joe Stiglitz this morning. There are many emerging countries, an issue that he didn't refer, where the poorest 10% earn only between 1.5% and 2% of total income, while the richest 10% accounts for more than 40%, a situation almost twice as bad as in developed countries. In conclusion, it would be possible to show and comment many more snapshots, but what has been shown is enough to discover in the emerging world, especially in the poorest part of it, flagrant phases of poverty and exclusion. In most developed countries, instead, stands out the inequality together with a widespread sensation that because globalization, the future will be worse than the present. Going now to the film, to the dynamic view of the recent globalization, the fact is that the distance between the levels of living, distance between the rich and the poor countries has fallen by almost half, from about 8 times in 1990 to slightly more than 4 times today. The standard of living of emerging countries ceased to diverge and began to converge with that of developed countries for the first time in 500 years. Regarding poverty, Africa and Asia account now for 95% of the 700 million people in extreme poverty. A quarter of a century ago, most of the 1.85 billion people affected by this scourge, representing 35% of the world population against 10% today. So we can find some progress also regarding poverty. In the measure of $3.10 per day, Nigeria, as I mentioned, still has 76.5%. So in spite that other countries are progressed, particularly in Africa, the problem is yet very serious. The future fighting against poverty could be more complicated, first because 80% of the extremely poor live in rural areas, generally more poverty prone, and second, more than 50% of the extreme poor live in sub-Saharan Africa, where the proportion of persons in that condition fell, but just from 54 to 41%, and increased in absolute terms around 200 million people. So perhaps the future is not going to be as easy as the past in fighting against poverty. Regarding hunger, some results are disappointing. Undernourished people went down from 1 billion in 1990 to 800 million nowadays. In Africa, in spite of a fall in the percentage from 27.5 to 20, it increased in absolute terms. However, still 1 person in 9 in the world is hungry and 1 in 3 is malnourished. So, however, if you see this picture to your right, you can see that famines is something of the past at the world level, and only occurred because of wars, but not as a natural state as it was in the past. Regarding health, regarding housing, still 1.8 billion people still live in the undeserving condition of slums, what is really a terrible problem. Regarding income distribution, I think that is one of the most polemic things I will say today. It could be hard to believe, but the rapid growth of many poor countries since 1990, especially that of China, has brought down inequality in the world distribution of income, and middle classes worldwide have doubled from 1.5 billion to 3 billion people in this century and are projected to get more than 5 billion in 2030. 13 years from now. At the same time, inequality increased in many countries and in almost all the developed world, with the aggravation of a huge concentration of income in the richest 1%, as we listened today from Joe Stiglitz. Now we can go to the hypotheses that are perhaps the core part of the presentation, and as I mentioned before, these are just hypotheses, because to explain the whole thing, the etiology of economic inclusion and exclusion at the world level, is something very ambitious. The guilt is from Pier Paolo Donati that gave me this title. But anyway, I am happy with at least try to find some hypotheses, because my perception is that if we lost the global picture and the dynamic picture, our assessment of the recent globalization will be very probably misleading. Well, the first explication or hypothesis from my point of view is demography. Excuse me. The world population would increase by more than 2 billion people until reaching 9.2 billion in 2040. Only 50 million of this total would live in developed countries, deepening the trend observed in the last decades. Europe, in particular, from my point of view, pursues the impossible trinity of very few children and immigrants and excellent social security systems. Pope Francis said that this implies like a suicide 10 days ago. And if President Trump fulfills some of his threats, that nowadays apparently seems not very probable, the United States could approach to an analogous utopia, or simply to overcome it by not disarming, but cut down the progressive taxation and many welfare problems. I think that this issue regarding developed countries is a very serious one, and its roots are, in the first instance, demographic, but what we can ask is, what are the causes of this demographic change? And it's not that easy to answer to this question. The second hypothesis is the economic development with unlimited supply of labor. This is an economic model written by an economist, Arthur Lewis, like 60 years ago. The question is that the model assumes a very abundant supply of labor in the cities, both because demography and rural-urban migration, due to falling agricultural productivity too. New urban people are mostly hardworking, that earn very low wages at the beginning, but improve rapidly afterwards, not only because fast economic growth, but also for huge investments in education, particularly in Asia. Social security is very limited compared to Western standards, what leads to high saving rates, and very important, they open themselves, the countries, gradually to trade and very fast to investment and technology. This growth strategy could only be prevented by armed conflicts even more serious than today's, or in a longer term, the continuity of deterioration of the environment. I mean, I think that this is a hardcore of the process of the recent globalization. The second, associated to the first one, is international trade. We discussed part of it this morning. First, it could lead to an absolute or relative fall in employment in industries that compete with imports from countries with lower wages. Second, in the importing countries, the price of labor relative to capital will also fall, and third, wages and employment in manufactured goods in the importing countries will probably fall. But this is not an iron law, but because if one sees what happened in Germany in the same period, it's very different from what happened in the United States. So, and it is very important to analyze also the exceptions, not only the apparent rules. Then we find a link between Asia and other emerging countries, because most Asia-Pacific countries have a low natural resources endowments per capita, and the contrary happens with many countries in Africa, the Middle East, Russia, Central Asia, and Latin America. So the adoption of the Lewisian growth model, which emerged in one after another Asian country, ended up driving rapid growth in most of the emerging world. So a new sort of de facto society between Asia-Pacific and the rest of the emerging world was operating, and perhaps will continue operating in the near future. It will depend in part about the decision on the globalization process. In the fourth place, we have the hangover of the big recession. What has been said so far must not lead to the mistake of ignoring evidences about many gross failures of globalization. The dramatic big recession of 2008 was fueled by predatory financial excesses, not fully remedied yet, and by insufficient global coordination that remain in place in matters like balance of payments imbalances or exchange rates misalignments. Evidence of the deterioration of the environment, the increase in the arms trade and drug trafficking are also growing and posing new and serious challenges. It's not only utopian to think today that today's national populist reactions will correct these shortcomings. I will develop more about this in a future section. Then we have the fact of the technological change. Here we have much more questions than answers, because nobody knows. We all are afraid about the impact of technological change, robotization, etc., on the demand for labor. Again, some evidences are not coherent with this fear. We have the case of the United States, one of the most technology-intensive economies, that created 2.3 million jobs per year since 2011, and the unemployment rate in the United States nowadays is 4.5%. Of course, it is evident that relative wages of people replaced by new technologies tend to be stagnant, basically stagnant. At the end of the exclusion poll, will be the older and less qualified workers living in less dynamic regions and countries, not necessarily the poorest ones. It is also clear that there is an urgent need for labor training policies, which unfortunately tend to be in short supply in the regions that are most in need of them. Then we have in the sixth place, the hypothesis of economic populism. When I speak of economic populism, and I want to be clear in this, is not something pejorative. It's a technical definition that immediately I will give you. Latin America has been the slowest growing subcontinent in the 21st century, in the last wave of globalization in general, with big differences among countries. It is a mistake to attributing these differences either to neoliberalism or to progressivism, because the main line dividing countries of good and bad performances is the one that distinguishes a rational and foresight economy from, on the other hand, the economic populism that raffles the future by maximizing consumption and punishing investments, sometimes at any cost. This is what I call economic populism. If we compare the performance of different countries in Latin America, you can see that Peru, that is clearly the Latin American star of the 21st century, the standard of living increased 26% since the last crisis. In Venezuela, in the other extreme, it fell 30%. So 56 percentage point, it was the difference in last just 10 years between Peru and Venezuela. Really amazing. Faced with such truths, it is surprising that critics of globalization have been at the same time indulgent with the damages inflicted by populism in Latin America, worse than those of globalization per se. It surprises too because this is the region which most clearly shows that national populism is not the way to eradicate poverty and achieve greater inclusion and equity. Now go to the issue of social and political culture. That is, I think, one of the more relevant hypotheses I share with you this afternoon. We need to find the very difficult best ways to build an inclusive and equitable society. This requires the constructive and also cooperative role of three actors: the civil society, the state, and the market. Notwithstanding the political discussions, and sometimes even academic ones, often simplistically focus on either more state or more market. Very simplistic approach. This dichotomy has limitations, but is relevant anyway. Considering the ratio of public spending to GDP in developed countries, there are extremes of 57% in Finland and 21% in Korea. So more than 2 times, almost 3 times. While in the US, it is in an intermediate position with 35.5%. Then we have analyzed the big change between the Gini coefficient before the state action and after the state action. Take the case of Finland. Finland is a very unequal country in which before public policies it has a Gini of 47, 0.47. Too much inequality, but that reduces it after the state action to 0.26. Amazing, one of the lowest Gini in the world. On the other hand, we have Korea that has a Gini of 0.34, and before the state action, and after the state action, it gets 0.30%. It is misleading to limit the discussion to just more or less market or state. Even the aforementioned sharp differences in equality before and after public policies show us that social relations relevant for the economy are very different in Korea, Finland, or the United States. Korean social ties lead to a less natural inequality than in Finland and in the United States. So we can see that it is possible to build different social approach to the economy. Finland society instead have decided to have a very efficient state at the time of reducing inequality. The United States, as it is or used to be, is well known more tolerant with economic inequalities, considering them basically normal or more normal than in other countries. Even to get the same or similar goals regarding economic and social inclusion, different countries would need different recipes. Some societies could need more state and more market at the same time, as it is very evident in failed or almost failed states nowadays. Other ones, as it is frequent in most emerging countries, could need better states and better markets at the same time, abating corruption, monopolies, and lacking accountability in both of them. Also, public-private cooperation or Moncloa-type social agreements could be needed in some cases, either to get investment partnerships, to improve macroeconomic policies, or to have at least some non-partisan state policies. In short, it seems evident that Scandinavia does not need the same proposals as Sub-Saharan Africa, nor Latin America the same as the Euro area or the Commonwealth of Independent States. And finally, the more audacious hypothesis is a question. If we are perhaps not living the beginning of change of civilizations. 10 years ago, in a seminar at this Pontifical Academy, in this room, Henry Kissinger said that the center of world economic power was inexorably shifting from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This is what began to happen in the last quarter of century, and it will be very difficult for it to be interrupted. It is also relevant to remind demography. Let us add that 88.4% of the increase in the world population from 2010 to 2040, that is to say, a total of almost 2 billion people will be in non-Western countries, while just 11.6 of them will be in the West. The share of world population living in developed countries would fall from 32% in 1950 to 14% in 2040. It is very unlikely that these demographic shifts will not also manifest sooner or later in significant changes in the overall preeminence of different continents or subcontinents. In a broader perspective, it is possible to think that the ongoing historical process shows signs of change of civilization that can be seen as a reversal of the European conquest in Africa, part of America and Asia that began 600 years ago. But whether it is just, between commas, a shift of the gravity of the global economy or a deeper change of one civilization, there is one point in which history does not offer much scope for optimism. With the very special exception of the United States replacing the United Kingdom as the center of the world economy, all such changes in the past have occurred through major wars. This is not a prediction, it is just a reminder of what human history was and about which it is convenient to be alert and vigilant. Other signs suggest that a world in which political, economic, social and cultural ties between countries and continents with historical cultural differences are preserved, it will be less conducive to wars. On the contrary, a world imbued with the values and disvalues of neo-national populism, which in addition to other futures is explicitly more prone to wars and armed violence, clearly increases the possibility of history repeating itself. Concluding remarks. My time is okay? The last stage of globalization, from my point of view, gave place to relevant but insufficient achievements in different forms of economic inclusions. We need an objective and nuanced balance, retaining its positive aspects and leaving aside the many negative facets it has. In other words, what we need is to improve globalization, not to abandon it. I think it would be a terrible mistake to try to go backwards in the process of globalization. And this should not impede us to be very realistically critics of the problems of globalization, but making the effort to analyze it with objectivity. Not a few of the criticism to the current realities in many developed countries contain truth. But this is not the case with most of the policies that these critics propose. In particular, building fortresses by simply closing the doors to immigration, trade, and international investment, plus increasing weaponry spending is not the way, not the least because they look alike too much to the policies that finally led to the great wars of the 20th century, but also because they will be, in the long run, or in the short run, ineffective. The root of this conflict seems to lie in a clear preference of present well-being over the future well-being. As the economy cannot satisfy these preferences, it results in lower economic growth or even stagnation. It is curious that neo-national populism proposes ways that can accentuate this conflict between the present and the future. This is clear in the limits of immigration, but also in economic nationalism, which paradoxically could only work if economic agents change their intertemporal preferences by accepting cuts in their standard of living to increase productivity through greater investments in physical and human capital and technology. And finally, as I said in previous meeting, I think we social scientists need to devote much more time to discuss what are the ways to preserve the good things of globalization and at the same time correcting its very important mistakes. Sometimes my perception is that we social scientists tend to see these discussions of public policies like a minor art that does not deserve our attention. But I think it is a mistake because the absence of not enough presence of social scientists in these discussions give all the place to politicians, and politicians many times do not have the incentives to find the proper ways, but to find just ways acceptable for the people now. Thank you very much.